Hello, and welcome to Stories from India, a podcast where we talk about myths, legends, and folktales from India. I am your host, Narad Muni, and I'm a mythological character myself. I have the gift of eternal life and knowledge of the past, the present, and the future. By profession, I'm a traveling musician and a storyteller. So the way I'm doing my job is by podcast. In this episode, we are back to Tenali Raman. Tenali Raman was this character from the 16th century. He was a jester in King Krishnadevaraya's court. Tenali Raman avoided a number of tricky situations and made a good pile of cash. Often, it was the king that he was cheating out of money. But he did not limit himself to fleecing just the king. In a previous episode, we've also seen him cheat a goddess, and in another one, he has cheated poor, hardworking people. Today's story is a little different than usual. In today's story, he's going to cheat some rishis. The only positive was that those rishis were themselves out to cheat the king. The story begins one evening with the king, Krishnadevarayar. The king had already had a long day. He glanced at his schedule, which had started at 6 a.m., with a jog along his own private lake, and he had just finished a lengthy trade meeting with a bunch of foreigners. He was already in a terrible mood. He didn't like conversing with foreign trade delegations. Come to think of it, he didn't even know which kingdom they were from. They had spent 3 long hours signaling to each other across the room, and all they had collectively agreed at the end of the meeting was how to say hello in each other's language. At least he hoped the word he had learnt meant hello. The next day's schedule showed 6 more hours of the same thing. The king would not be able to handle it without the little entertainment provided by Tenali Raman during the commercial breaks. Thankful that his schedule was finally clear for the night, the king decided to turn in. But things were about to take a turn for the worse. The king was going to have a very long night. Being the last one to leave, he was just locking up the throne room when a messenger rushed to him, breathless. "Your Majesty, an emergency. You need to go to the hospital right away." "The hospital? What is it?" the king asked anxiously. "It's a great white building that people go to when they're ill, Your Majesty. But that's not important right now. What's happening now is that your mother is unwell and she's there." The king hopped onto the saddle and headed straight for the hospital. Even though it was late at night and there wasn't much traffic, he used the medieval Indian version of a red revolving beacon and a siren. And that basically consisted of a second person following on horseback whose only job it was to wave a lantern and to imitate a siren. And because that helper was keeping pace with the king's horse, it's understandable that by the time the king reached the hospital, his ears were ringing with that siren noise. He couldn't believe he let his Minister of Transport talk him into this. Strobe lights and sirens were all the rage in the other kingdoms, he had been told. "Tomorrow, I'm going to make that minister travel with a loud siren. Then he'll know what it feels like." At the hospital, the king asked the doctors how his mother was doing. "She's very ill, Your Majesty," one doctor said. "You may have to bid farewell to her soon." "Why? Are visiting hours over? Asked the king, clearly not reading between the lines. Er, I meant Her Highness is getting ready for her journey to the great beyond. The doctor tried again. What rubbish! The lady is ill. How could she possibly be setting out on a journey? And you, as her doctor, you didn't try to stop her and prescribe rest? But the matter was finally explained to him. He rushed in to meet his mother. She saw him and narrowed her eyes with suspicion. It seemed that she had a long internal debate before she finally explained what was on her mind. She began, Son, you've been a disappointment all your life. First, I had you when I wanted a girl. Next, you never got the grades in school that I wanted. You didn't learn to manage the kingdom quite like your father did. And now, I've been debating whether I should let you fulfill my last wish. Knowing you, I'm sure you'll bungle it up. But what have I got to lose? So I'll ask you in the hopes that your staff is not entirely incompetent. Before I pass away, I would like to eat a mango. That would have been the easiest wish to fulfill, if it had not been the middle of winter. Given this was the 16th century, there were neither refrigerators nor sophisticated mechanisms to preserve mangoes several months after the season was over. Nevertheless, the king sent out all his soldiers in every possible direction. He also announced a big reward, the kind that would get mercenaries like Tenali Raman to pull a mango out of his hat. But Tenali wasn't always as resourceful as everyone imagined him to be. Knowing full well that he would not be able to fetch his king a mango at this time of the year, he simply pretended not to be aware of the king's quest for the fruit. A day or two passed, and still no mango. Krishnadevaraya's mother breathed her last, but not before berating him one last time for having failed her yet again. Her last words to him were, At the very least, don't forget me. To a casual observer, her words meant that the king was not to forget that he had had a mother and all the things she had done for him. But the king didn't want to leave something vital to chance, so he consulted with his psychologist. These were a group of rishis in the king's employ. You could tell that they were not scientists from the very fact that they all usually agreed with each other. They were unanimous now as well. Of course, the king's mother did not want her son to forget her and her role in his upbringing. But that was not what she meant in her last words. What she was talking about was the mango, her last wish that went unfulfilled. The king thought that something was off here. Firstly, his mother would have said, Don't forget my wish, or don't forget the mango. But she had said, Don't forget me. Secondly, the mango was no longer her last wish. It was her second to last wish, supplanted at the top spot by her wish not to be forgotten. To fulfill her real last wish, all he had to do was not forget her. Or so he thought. Maybe it was the emotions he was feeling on that day. He did not raise these objections to the rishis. Who was he to challenge their wisdom? And if you're puzzled by that, don't be. Even the greatest of kings considered their wisdom and analytical skills to be inferior to rishis. It was built into their education system, which was run by, you guessed it, rishis. So the king quietly accepted the rishi's interpretation of his mother's last words. The solution, the rishis said, was to fulfill her wish indirectly. She had wanted a mango, so the solution was to distribute mangoes to all the rishis. That would satisfy her soul. But it's still winter. There are no mangoes yet, the king replied. Your Majesty, we don't mean real mangoes. We mean mangoes made out of solid gold, a rishi said. What? Why out of gold and not silver? Or even wood? I've got excellent woodworkers. Just the other day, one of them carved an ordinary piece of wood into an extremely realistic pineapple. Sorry, Your Majesty, but it has to be gold. According to the royal cook, your mom's favorite mangoes were golden. The cook was obviously talking about a color and not the material, the king said. But to satisfy her soul, it's not a straightforward interpretation. If she had liked mangoes of the Kesar variety, we would have asked for saffron. If she had liked the Totapuri variety, we'd have asked for a parrot and a puri. The rishis replied, even though they totally would not have. They would have found a way to justify extracting gold from the king. From their point of view, Tenali Raman had been easily extracting gold from the king all the time. It was time that others got in on that scheme. The king agreed to the rishi's plan and commissioned his goldsmith to create dozens of golden mangoes. If the treasury ran dry, he could take gold about the palace and melt it. But the mangoes were the highest priority now. The news spread fast. The courtiers began to notice that more and more gold fittings in the courtroom were disappearing as all the gold was melted down to create the mangoes. Tenali Raman was naturally worried. If all the gold was gone, how was he to continue fleecing the king? Nope, he must put a stop to this. He had an idea, which he put into action right away. He invited the whole group of rishis to his own home. Now, it would have been impossible to pull the rishis away when they were so keenly observing their golden mangoes being created. But Tenali used a little psychology. He indicated in the invitation letter that he was doing this to fulfill his own mother's last wish. Knowing that Tenali must have accumulated a lot of gold over the years from the king, the greedy rishis agreed and showed up at his doorstep at the appointed time. We are sorry for your loss, Tenali, said a rishi, opening the conversation. Thank you. It was a long time ago, replied Tenali. My mom had one last wish that I could not fulfill. It's been eating me up all these years. But now, your wisdom has showed me the way. The rishis were waiting for his next words. But Tenali was silent as he went about methodically locking all the doors and windows so there was no chance of escape. Tenali then walked to a corner of the room where a fire was going with a hot iron rod on it. He put on an oven mitt and picked up the rod. The rishis were extremely nervous now when he approached them with it. Tenali explained, My mother had rheumatoid arthritis. While she lay on her deathbed, her joints were hurting badly, and she asked me to apply this hot rod to them. Sorry that it seems brutal, but hey, it's 16th century medicine. What can you do? I never got to apply the rod. By the time it was heated, she had passed away. But I admire you, brave and wise men, who are going to accept this to satisfy her soul. The next 30 minutes are too violent to describe. So let's see what happened outside Tenali's hut. The neighbors heard the Rishi's screams and alerted the authorities. Noting that this was the home of the royal jester and that the screams were identified as belonging to the royal astrologers/psychologists, the king himself was alerted. This was a grave matter, and the king rushed to the scene of the crime. No one else had dared to interfere, and the screams were still continuing. It was only when the king announced his presence that Tenali opened the door. The rishis rushed out, screaming and shouting at Tenali. Tenali calmly replied to the king's question of what was going on. Oh, your majesty, I'm just fulfilling my mother's last wish. Your mother? I didn't know you had one. Everyone has a mother. Everyone must have a mother, your majesty. You're probably just surprised that she has never been mentioned before on this podcast. Anyway, that's besides the point. You're wondering what's going on. It's simple. I'm trying to treat my mom's arthritis. By hurting these poor rishis? How will that help your mother? That makes no sense, the king said. Tenali did not even have to respond. He just smiled, and the light dawned on the king's face. Oh, I see, the king replied. I've answered my own question there, haven't I? Just like hurting these rishis won't help your mother's soul, giving them those golden mangoes is not going to help my mother's soul either. Well, that was that. The king decided not to give any golden mango to any of the rishis. It was still ultimately a win-win for mostly everyone. The king did not bankrupt the kingdom. He did give one mango to Tenali though, because the jester had helped him to see the light. But Tenali did not get to keep most of it. He had to pay for the rishi's medical expenses, which, after 30 minutes of arthritis treatment, were quite significant. Still, he came out just ahead, but more importantly, was happy that the king's treasury retained most of the gold. He could continue to rely on that source and tap into it when needed. It would be easy to keep extracting it from the king, a little at a time. The king continued to employ the rishis and continued to fund them. And the rishis, for their part, learned to be more subtle when asking the king for grants in the future. The fact that the king had not punished them proved to the rishis the effectiveness of the education system they had designed to establish their superiority over royalty. That's all for now. Check out the links in the show notes to previous Tenali Raman stories. There are many parallels between Tenali Raman and the king and the stories of Akbar and Birbal. The setup in Birbal's case was very similar, but the stories themselves are quite different, and the reward often isn't gold for Birbal, but simply praise from the emperor. While Tenali Raman is remembered for his wit and his stories, he was also a great poet and a polyglot. He was fluent in 8 languages. It's a shame that he spent all of his time and energy in tricking people out of money. In the next episode, we'll finally start on a new series that I've been aiming to cover for a while. It's the Singhasan Battisi, or the 32 Throne Stories. There's a link with the Vikram and Betal stories, but we'll discuss that next week. If you have comments or suggestions, or if there are particular stories that you would like to hear, please do let me know by leaving a comment or a review on the site sfipodcast.com or tweet at sfipodcast. You can also find me on Instagram and Facebook. Be sure to subscribe to the show to get notified automatically of new episodes. A big thank you to each and every one of you for your continued support and your feedback. The music is from purpleplanet.com. That's purple-planet.com. I'll see you next time.